And welcome, everyone. I just did something I'm not supposed to do. Okay, good. Before we get started on new material, I want to go back and look at, and I just made it disappear. So where did it go? Ah, there it is. I am not the most gifted person when it comes to electronics. Okay, so before we get started, let's look at the structure. So we are here in the Jerusalem section, and we are going to finish today the first part, the A part of the Jerusalem section. And remember, I told you that what A introduces, A prime is going to start resolving. And what did part A introduce? It introduced the very complicated entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, which had both positive and negative aspects. He's proclaiming, blessed is he.
Did everything freeze?
Yes. I
Okay.
think he may have to restart, or we have to wait for the data coming out from his.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I stay mute because I have a deaf husband in the background who will talk and not know it.
Okay, my screen went dead for a little bit. Is everybody able to hear me? Okay, good. We'll go back. I think it's because the phone was ringing. Every time the phone rings, something happens with my internet. I guess it's because this comes through my phone lines. I don't know. Okay, so we started off with the ambiguous entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, with some people saying the right thing, some people saying the wrong thing. Then we have Jesus cursing the fig tree, which is a prophetic act. Then he goes in and stops people from moving around the court of women. He turns over the tables, another prophetic act. Then we have the fig tree withering, and in that intercalation, which I have discussed several times before, that means that Jesus's prophetic action is a prophetic enactment of the destruction of the temple. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, then we started the interpretive key, which started off with the chief priests, scribes, and elders asking Jesus where his authority came from. And he says, well, I'll tell you if you tell me where John's baptism came from. And he showed us that the chief priests, scribes, and elders, who are the primary teachers in the temple, are more concerned about how they look in front of other people than what the truth is. So that makes them look very bad. Now, in the rest of this section, Jesus is going to work his way through all teaching offices in first century Judaism. So he's going to meet up with and defeat in argument all the teachers of Israel. Any questions? Also note that every teaching that Jesus gives is triggered by a trick question, which is designed to get him in trouble with either religious authorities or political authorities. So all of these are trick questions designed to make Jesus say something that he could be arrested for, either by political leaders or religious leaders. He not only gets out of all of these in a clever way, but he shows different aspects of the failings. The failing of the chief prescribes and elders, as previously said, was they're more concerned with how they look in public than what the truth is. Any questions before we leave this page and start today's class? Okay. So now we go to today's class. So he just finished with the chief prescribes and elders. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and Herodians. Now, the Pharisees are religious leaders and Herodians are political leaders. So this is going to be a very loaded trick question that's designed to get him in trouble either with the Pharisees or the Herodians, in order that they might trip him up by means of a word. Okay? And coming, they say to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true, and that it is not a concern to you about anyone." In other words, you don't look at people's status or dignity in the community. For you do not look at the face of human beings, but in truth, you teach the way of God. Now, notice this entire statement is disingenuous. They are lying when they say this because they do not believe this about Jesus. But to the audience, this is absolutely correct. So this is ironic. Things are ironic when the surface meaning of something to the person who says it means one thing, and to the person who hears it means something else. In this case, it means the exact opposite. In fact, they do not think that Jesus is true and that it's not concerned, it is not concerned to him about anyone because he doesn't look at the face of human beings, but in truth, he teaches the way of God. They do not believe it, but we do. And this begins a new theme in Mark where the opponents of Jesus lie the truth. In other words, they are lying when they say it, but we, the audience, know that it's true. And this falls under the narrative category of irony. Okay? So here's the question. Is it permitted? Remember, this is the legal word. Is it against Mosaic law to give the census tax to Caesar or not? Do we give or don't we give? Now, this is a trick question because in the scriptures, the Old Testament, God punished David for taking a census for the purpose of laying a tax on God's people. So that's against the will of God. So you cannot impose a census tax on God's people. So if Jesus says, no, don't give it, then the Herodians will arrest him. But if Jesus says, do pay it, then the Pharisees can arrest him. So it's a trick question. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, why are you testing me? Bring to me a denarius so that I can see. So Jesus pretends that he's never seen one before, which is possible, unlikely, but possible. Bring me one so that I can see it. Now, remember, we're in the court of men where only clean things can be present. But they brought it. So notice, who violates Mosaic law in this story? The people who bring an unclean denarius into the court of men. So they're trying to trap him up, and he has just trapped them up. Okay? He's made it obvious that they can produce a denarius on demand, so they must have unclean things in the court of men. But they brought it, and he says to them, notice he doesn't touch it. They're touching an unclean thing in the court of men. Whose image is it, and whose inscription? But they said to him, Caesar's. But Jesus said to them, the things of Caesar give back to Caesar, and the things of God to God. And they were completely amazed at him. So he keeps himself out of trouble. Remember, we're dealing with a society in which most people can't read and write. So you would put a picture on things. If any of you have ever been to Pompeii, anybody in the audience ever been there? Well, if you walk the streets of Pompeii, on each building, there's painted a picture of what goes on in that building. So you know the building you're looking for by the picture on the outside. If it's a place to get beverages, there'll be pitchers and glasses. If it one place is a place of prostitution, and you can tell from the sign it's a place of prostitution. Just let's leave it at that. But you put your picture on it to explain what it is. So Jesus says, well, look, you're holding a coin that has the picture of Caesar on it, and it has his name, his inscription on it. It must be his. So give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and the things of God to God. So he doesn't say, give the word that they were trying to trap him in, so that they might trap him in a word. I can't find it. So that they might trap him in a word. The word was going to be give. That's what they were trying to get him to say, give to Caesar. But what he does is say, pay back. In other words, if it's a loan, pay it back. So he doesn't give them the word they're looking for, because Mosaic law says if you owe somebody something, you're supposed to give it back. The other thing that frequently gets lost here is when he says, well, whose image and inscription is on it? And this word icon, from which we get the English word icon, is a religiously loaded word. And if we go back to the Septuagint, the Old Testament in Greek, let's see, where is it? Here it is. It shows up for the first time in chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, let us make the human being, the word is human being, not man, in our own image and likeness. And here is image right here. So when Jesus says, whose image is on it? Well, Caesar's, then pay back what you owe to Caesar. But whose image is he looking at around him? He's looking at the faces of the people around him who are created in the image of God. So they have to pay back themselves to God. See how that works? Any questions? So this is a very, very, and by the way, the first three occurrences of this word refer to God creating human beings in God's own image. So that word is a very important theological word. So not only does he show that the people who are trying to trap him are carrying unclean things into the temple, but he circumvents everything by saying, well, if his picture's on it, give it back to him. Any questions? So now he's dealt with the chief priests, scribes, elders, Pharisees, and Herodians. So the last group of teachers, the most important in a sense, the Sadducees. The Sadducees party was limited to people who belonged to the priestly class. So these are all Levites and priests. Now, they are different from the other people we've met, the scribes, the Pharisees, I don't know about the Herodians, and the elders, because they do not accept the whole Bible as authoritative. They only accept the first 5 books. They only accept the Pentateuch, the law, basically. That's all they accept. They reject all of the prophets and all of the writings. So when Jesus deals with them, he's going to have to use something from what they accept as being legitimate. Okay? And Sadducees come to him, who say that there is not a resurrection. And they were asking him, saying, now notice the question, teacher, Moses wrote for us that if someone's brother dies and does not leaves behind a wife and does not leave behind children, that his brother take the woman and raise up offspring for his brother. This is Mosaic law, the Levirate legislation. Here's the deal. In the first 5 books of the scriptures, there is no talk of resurrection. Therefore, the Sadducees do not accept the fact of the resurrection. But there is this law, the Levirate law. Since there is no resurrection, this law was established according to the book of Leviticus so that the name of a man might not die out in Israel. Since there is no resurrection, the only immortality that a man has is through his children, because his children are known as the son of so-and-so or the daughter of so-and-so. So his name stays alive after his death. That is the purpose of this law. Okay? But notice their question. There were 7 brothers, and the first one took a wife and died and did not leave offspring. And the second took her and died and did not leave behind offspring. And likewise the third. And the 7 did not leave behind offspring. Last of all, also the woman died. In the resurrection, when they rise, of whom will she be, of which of them will she be wife? Because the 7 were had her as wife. Now, this question is illegitimate because Mosaic law says explicitly, remember the John the Baptist story? He said to Herod, you cannot have the wife of your brother. Why? Because as long as your brother is alive, having sex with his original wife is incest. It falls under Mosaic law, incest laws. You cannot marry the wife of a living brother. Otherwise, you commit incest. That's what got John the Baptist locked up because he was telling Herod that. What does that mean if you cannot marry the wife of a living brother because that's incest? What does that mean about marrying the wife of a dead brother? Well, in order not to violate incest laws, it has to mean that marriage ends at physical death. So their question has absolutely no merit because you're only married for life. And I had one uncle, when I congratulated him on his 40 years of marriage, he said, most people say marriage is for life. I consider it a life sentence. But you get the point. It's over when you die. So there's no problem with a woman having 7 husbands if each of her husbands died before she married the next one. So their question is completely without merit. And Jesus lets him know this. Jesus said to them, isn't it because of this that you are misled, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God? So they don't know the scriptures because the scriptures imply that when you die, marriage is over. It's a lifelong contract that ends at the death of one of the spouses. So they don't know the law. And then he goes on to say they don't know the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry if they're a male, nor are they given in marriage, that's if they're a female, but they are like the angels in the heavens. Well, what does it mean to be like the angels in the heavens? Well, there's only one thing we know for sure about the angels in the heavens besides they're there, and that is that they don't have physical bodies, and so they live forever because it's our bodies that die. So when they rise, they don't marry or are given in marriage because they are like the angels. They live forever. And if you remember back to the second creation story, the original plan of God was to create Adam, whom God split into the male and the female, and they were going to live forever with God in the Garden of Eden. Excuse me. They were going to live forever with God there. And children only became necessary when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and so they would die. So children become necessary because the first 2 people who were supposed to live forever with God in paradise, Eden, sinned, lost access to Eden and the tree of life, and so they would die. So for there to be a human race, people had to have kids. Okay? But if in the resurrection you live forever, there's no longer a reason to have kids. So people don't get married, nor are they given in marriage. So the whole Levirate law is useless because no one's name ever dies out forever. Because whoever rises lives forever. This is a very sophisticated argument on the part of Jesus. But concerning the dead, that they rise, you've read, haven't you, in the book of Moses at the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are much misled. Why does this prove Jesus's point? Because Moses lived 800 or so years after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God didn't say, I was the God of Abraham, as if Abraham still isn't there anymore. I was the God of Isaac. I was the God of Jacob. No, God says, I am the God of Isaac, of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. So they must still be alive somewhere. And he uses a statement from Exodus, which is part of what they believe. So he proves it to them. I'm afraid I've been coughing a lot today, so I will have a few problems. Any questions?
Yes, yes. I must have missed something. The Sadducees these are still the Sadducees asking
Right.
about whose wife is she going to be?
In the resurrection.
But you said they don't believe in the resurrection.
Well, right. They're doing this to trap Jesus into proving that he's wrong. Their
Okay.
example is supposed to prove Jesus wrong, and it proves them not knowing not knowing the scriptures or the power of God.
They look like idiots.
All of the opponents look like idiots. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
Remember, they're all trick questions, but this trick question implodes before even Jesus gets to it because they don't know their own scriptures. A man couldn't marry his brother's wife unless the marriage ends at death. So they don't even know their own scriptures, and they've only got 5 books to worry about. Everybody else has the whole Old Testament. Any other questions?
It's not a question, but it seems that because there's no response by the Sadducees or anything, he seems like he's totally stumped them, and they're standing there probably with their mouths open.
Very good. It's a very good catch because in each of the occurrences, he leaves his opponents open mouthed with nothing to say. So what has he just done? This is the interpretive key of the first part of the Jerusalem section. He has proved that every one of the teachers of ancient Israel is incompetent. And he is supremely competent. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to remember that for 2 weeks because it's going to be crucial in the last part of the Jerusalem section. But for the moment, well, I'll bring it all together at the end of chapter 12 when we finish this section. Any other questions? And coming forth, one of the scribes, hearing them arguing, seeing that Jesus responded well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all, or first of all the commandments, either way, first commandment of all. Now, this is a trick question too, believe it or not, because we have historical records from this very time that there were 2 opposing views in the Pharisaic schools. The Sadducees didn't have schools. The Pharisees were the ones who ran the schools. And there were 2 opinions on this. And the reason is that the law of Moses starts off in a funny way. The first line is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your life, with all your mind, and all your strength." And then you get the 10 commandments. So what's the first of all the commandments? Is it the "Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God"? Is that the first commandment? Or is it commandment number 1, keep holy the Sabbath? So this is a trick question too. But Jesus sidesteps this one in a new way. Jesus responded, the first is, and I'm going to repeat it because this is the beginning. It's called the Shema Yisrael in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you will love the Lord your God from all of your heart and all of your life and all of your mind and all of your strength. So this is the first command God gives to people. So Jesus cannot be faulted for saying, well, this is the first command God gave. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Greater than these, there is no other commandment. Now, this is shocking to anybody who's around there. Why? Because the first commandment, well, the first command God gave is to love God. Okay? Then come the 10 Commandments. Then come the purity laws and cleanliness laws and holiness laws and all of those laws. And way, way down on the list is the love of neighbor. So it's not the second commandment. It might be 200 or 300 or maybe 600. I haven't counted up all the laws. And he yanks that from way down in the mix to position number 2. Does anybody see why this is so important to understand everything that has happened in the gospel to this point? If the second most important commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, how does that explain all sorts of odd things that happened earlier in this gospel? Anybody want to take a stab at it? If the love of neighbor is the only commandment that comes, is the second commandment that comes before all the other commandments that God gave us, what does this explain about Jesus? Okay, nobody's piping up, so I'm going to give you some hints. When Jesus is in Simon and Andrew's house and his mother-in-law is lying sick and therefore unclean, what's the first thing Jesus does? He touches her.
Yes, yes, that's what I was gonna say.
He touches her, he grabs her hand before he heals her. What did he do? He welcomed her back into the community. He welcomed her back into the community of God's people before he even heals her, because that is the loving thing to do. When Jesus touches the little girl who everybody says is dead and then says, I say to you, rise, and she rises. Why did he do that? He welcomes even the dead back into community. He puts his hands on unclean people. He eats with unclean people. All of these things that they've been trying to get him on from the beginning of the gospel, this explains the whole thing. Where does Mark put it? At the very end of his public teaching. This is part of the mysterious Mark. If we had known this from the beginning, none of that would be surprising. And if you go to Matthew and Luke, where do they put it? Right up front. So that you know why Jesus is doing what he's doing. But not in Mark. He saves it for the end. And this is going to be the first of a series of, wait a minute, you have to go back and look at the whole story from a different perspective. You have to repent, change your mindset. Now everything starts to make sense. Why was he doing that? He wasn't doing it because he wanted to. Well, he did. He wanted to, but he wasn't doing it to break the law. He was doing it to keep what he knows to be the true mind of God, which is that the love of God is first and the love of neighbor is second. See how all of that makes sense now? Any questions? And the scribe said to him, well, do you say, well, teacher, in truth, do you say that he is one and there is no other than he, and loving him from all of your heart and all of your understanding and all of your strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself is greater than all of the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. In other words, the scribe says to him, loving God and your neighbor before all else is more important than anything that the temple can accomplish. Because the whole temple's about burnt offerings and sacrifices. Which means what, technically? Well, it means that if you can get these two commandments right, those other ones really don't matter, especially the ones concerning the temple, which Jesus has prophetically enacted as being destroyed. Now we find out, well, if you've got these two commandments and you can keep them, of course, that's a big if, then you really don't need all of those other temple things. So here goes another nail in the coffin of the temple. If you can do it, these two commandments, and these are the only commandments Jesus gives in this regard. He recites other commandments, so he accepts lots of the 10 commandments, but this is the only time he actually speaks commandments. And Jesus looking at him, and Jesus seeing him, that he responded with understanding, said to him, you are not far from the reign of God. And no one dared to ask him any longer anything. Okay? But notice this sentence, you are not far from the reign of God. This is a positive statement, but it's not completely positive. Why? Because we found out in chapter 9 that if you want to inherit life from God, you've got to enter the reign of God. So when Jesus says you're not far from it, you've got the theory, but you've got to put it into practice for it to work. And now, Abe, we get the official statement, no one dared any longer to ask him anything, period. He shut them all up. Okay? But we're not finished. He's got one more public teaching. Any questions before we leave from there? Because this is the bottom line of the whole gospel. The first and second commandments. If you've got the first and second commandments, you don't need all the others, and certainly not the tradition of the elders. There I go being too clear again. Okay. And Jesus responding to what? Their silence. Was saying to them, teaching in the temple, how is it that the scribes say, he's really on to the scribes, because that was a scribe, here's a scribe, and the next teaching is about a scribe. How do the scribes say that the Christ is David's son? How can they do that? David himself said by the Holy Spirit, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right until I place your enemies underneath your feet. David himself says him to be Lord. And from where is he his son? Now, this is very important because he answered the other problem from the beginning of the gospel when people were saying, blessed is the coming reign of our father David. People who look at Jesus as son of David make the mistake that he's going to be an anointed, a Messiah, a Christ, like David, who was a military genius and conquered all of his enemies and set his people free from the dominion of all outsiders. That's the kind of Messiah that the 12 are looking for. That's the kind of a Messiah that half the people coming into Jerusalem are looking for. And Jesus says, you've got a problem because you're thinking of the Messiah, the Christ, or the anointed. That's just the Hebrew, Greek, and English words for the same thing. You're thinking that he's the son of David, but he's in fact the Lord of David. So he's not he might be a biological descendant of David, but he is not a Messiah, Christ, Lord like David was. He's superior to David. And he's a superior one who is, according to his entrance into Jerusalem, solely humble, not military. Now, if you want a little bit history to this quote, it didn't mean this in the original context, because David always referred to himself as my Lord. So when David said it, it would be the Lord said to me, basically. That's what God said to David. But that custom died with the Davidic monarchs. So when you read that statement in the time of Jesus, it has, and it even back then, it had a possible alternative interpretation, but Jesus takes the one that he wants. But David went around calling himself my Lord, like the King of England goes around calling himself we, even though it's only one person. Okay? And the next sentence is eerie. And the great crowd listened to him sweetly. Does that ring any bells for anybody? I'll give you a hint. It's in the parallel section of the Galilee section, or I should say, it's in the parallel subsection of the Galilee section. I even told everybody to remember this when we went over it. Some other character in this story listened to someone sweetly. Who was it? Herod listened to John the Baptist sweetly. And what did he do 8 or so verses later? He ordered his execution. Who is now the crowd, the great crowd is listening to Jesus sweetly? What do we know if we're paying close attention? They are going to call for the death of Jesus. They're going to turn on him like Herod turned on John the Baptist. Remember I told you what's introduced in Galilee gets resolved in Jerusalem? It's happening. It's happening. Now, we don't know where this one, the next teaching occurs. It's between a teaching in the court of men and a teaching within the court of women and Gentiles. So I don't know where this one occurs exactly. I tend to think it occurs in, and this is just me, I can't prove it. I tend to think it occurs in the court of women. And in his teaching, he was saying, watch out for the scribes wanting to walk around in robes, stolai. We get the English word stole, that little piece of garment that the priest puts on him. It was a sign of dignity back then. Walking around in robes and wanting the first seats, wanting the first seats wanting greetings in the marketplace and the first seats in the synagogues and the head seat in dinners. And this word is for official type dinners, big dinners. The ones devouring the houses of widows and praying at length for show, they will receive the greater judgment. So Jesus doesn't have a lot of respect for the scribes. Okay. And judgment in this, it can either mean judgment or condemnation. It's an interesting thing about Greek law is that judgments almost always, when you hear about them, are negative. So he has very little respect for the crowds. And sitting down opposite the treasury, which would be like the collection booth, he was watching how the crowd cast brass or bronze. It's the same word in Greek. So these are bronze coins. They're worth less than silver coins, but more than other coins made out of cheaper metals into the treasury. And many rich ones were casting in many such coins, understood. And coming along, one poor widow cast in 2 lepta, okay, which is a quadrans. The smallest official monetary unit of the Roman Empire was the quadrans. It was equal to 1/64th of a denarius. That was the smallest coin they minted. But since a denarius was a full day's wage, people frequently needed less than a quadrans. So they would take a hatchet and cut it into 2 lepta, which means 2 leftover pieces. It's sort of like, and I don't think young people in English would even remember this, but it was like 2 bits when you could cut a quarter in half. So 2 lepta, it was basically half of the smallest unit of coin. So she gave 2 lepta. And summoning his disciples, so he's back to only talking to his disciples, and he's around where women can do things, so he's in the court of women. And summoning his disciples, he said to them, truth I say to you, amen I say to you, this widow, poor widow, cast in more than all of the ones casting into the treasury, because all of them were casting in out of their excess, but she, from her lack, cast in everything she had, her whole life. Now, this word is bios. This woman basically is giving her bios. Now, we've gone through the different words for life in Greek, but I'll remind you, bios is the animal life that all of us share with the animal kingdom. In other words, dogs and cats have bios, human beings have bios. That's our physical existence. And because it's our physical existence, it could also mean what's required to keep you alive. Okay? She basically gave her whole life, physical life, for that temple which Jesus says is going to be destroyed. And Jesus makes note of it. She's willing to give up her physical life for the temple as it stands today. Anybody want to take a guess of what the exact parallel story is in the last part of the Jerusalem section? Nobody wants to guess? It's the story of the death of Jesus. Except there, he loses his entire psyche, which is the other word for life we've seen. It's the one in the love your Lord your God with all your life. Remember, psyche is something that only human beings on earth have. It includes our intellect, our ability to speak, our ability to create. It's everything that we are. Jesus said back in chapter 8, you've got to be willing to destroy your psyche, your entire being, in order to save it. This poor widow woman gives her whole physical life for the old temple. And as we will see at the end of the gospel, Jesus gives all of himself. And one of the consequences, one of the purposes of that is for the temple which he is about to build. Okay? So I know I'm jumping ahead, but you've got to catch this parallel, because Jesus is basically saying, just like this woman gave her physical life to this temple, Jesus is going to give his life as a ransom for many, and part of that is going to be constructing a new temple, as we'll see in chapter 14. Okay? That's pretty heavy-duty stuff. But notice how cleverly Mark has put together chapters 11 and 12. We have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is as the Messiah, and the temple is going to be destroyed because it's not producing fruit. On the other side, and then in the interpretive key, we find out that, well, what the temple is supposed to be is a house of prayer for all the nations. Jesus says it isn't. And the other thing it's supposed to be is a place for the teaching of God's people. And he's just proved that all the teachers are useless, except for himself. And then the scribe comes along and says, well, loving God and your neighbor is more important than all this temple stuff. And Jesus compliments him on it. He says, you're not far from the reign of God. So basically in chapters 11 and 12, Mark does away with the temple. The temple has failed, and God and Jesus have no more use for it. Remember, the theme of the Jerusalem section is failure. Any questions before we go into chapter 13? This is heavy-duty stuff, and we're going through it pretty quickly, but if there are no questions, I'll move on. Now we are into the center of the Jerusalem section. It's chapter 31. And if we go back to the center of the Galilee section to which it is parallel, it's all teaching like this was, like this is going to be. And the last thing that Jesus did after talking about the sower sows and don't put your lamp under a bed or a basket, and he goes on and on and on. He ends it by saying, the measure by which you measure will be measured out to you and will be added to you. That's about the last judgment. And so it ends, the teaching in the center of the Galilee section ends with one teaching about the end. And, and chapter 13, the whole thing from beginning to end is about the end of the world. See how he's resolving what he started in the Galilee section, now in the Jerusalem section? I know I keep hitting on that, but it's important to see how carefully constructed this gospel is. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me. Or at least it's kept me interested for the last 40 years teaching it. And when he was coming out of the temple, one of his disciples says to him, "Teacher, look, what sort of stones and what sort of buildings?" Okay, now, believe it or not, in the ancient world, in the first century, the temple in Jerusalem was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was huge. It was adorned with 500 years of gold and silver and stuff like that. I mean, it was one of the true wonders of the world back then. And this disciple has the typical reaction to it, like, we've never seen anything like this. And Jesus said to him, you see these great buildings? And then he makes what is called a future emphatic prohibition. It means that this cannot be denied. There will not be left here a stone on a stone which will not be cast down. So temple's on the way out. And when he was sitting onto the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, so all of this occurs from a place where you can look down on the city and see the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew were asking him privately, so they take him aside. Say to us when these things will be, and what is the sign when these things are about to be completed, for all these things are about to be completed, fulfilled, or brought to completion. So they want to know about the end. Jesus was just talking about the end of the temple. That's not the end. They want to know when everything is, all these things are going to be brought to completion. But Jesus began to say to them, watch out lest someone mislead you. So they ask about the end of all these things. When is everything going to be brought to completion? And Jesus spends an entire chapter telling them, well, he spends half of this chapter telling them when it's not going to happen. He reminds me of a modern theologian. They make a statement and then they spend 15 pages telling you what it doesn't mean. So he's going to tell them, well, I'm going to tell you something, but I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to tell you what does not constitute the end. Do not be misled. Many will come concerning my name, or by my name, which would mean they're using his name, saying, I am he. And they will mislead many. So don't trust people who say that they're Jesus. But when you hear about wars and reports of wars, do not be dismayed. It's necessary that they happen, but the end, the telos, the completion is not yet. So if somebody comes and says he's Jesus, that's not the end. If you hear about wars and reports of wars, that's not the end. And he doesn't use the word eschaton, the last thing. He uses the telos, the completion point. That's not the end. Because nation will rise against nation and reigns against reigns. There will be earthquakes everywhere, in every place, katatopos. There will be hungers or famines, same word in Greek, the beginning of the birth pangs. So this isn't even the end, this is just the beginning of and he considers it to be like labor. It's just the sign that labor is onsetting. And what is the labor for? It's to birth the next stage. So this is just the beginning. We're not even close to the end when you have all of this. But watch out yourselves. They will hand you over to Sanhedrin, and they will bind you into synagogues, and they will stand you before, you will be stood before governors and kings because of me for testimony to them. All of this is happening, and this is just the beginning. And to all the nations, it is necessary that to all the nations, first, the gospel be proclaimed. So it's necessary at this point to proclaim the gospel to all the nations. So everybody has to have heard the gospel. And when they lead you, handing you over, that's the same word they use for John the Baptist and Jesus. Don't worry in advance what you will say, but whatever is given to you in that hour, speak this. For it is not you the ones speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will hand over brother to death, and a father a child, and they will children will rise up against parents, and they will kill them, and you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one persevering to the telos, the completion, this one will be saved. But this is all just the beginning. Okay? Now, what is all this parents handing over children, a brother killing brother, and all of this stuff? What is this referring to? Well, we're at the very, very beginning glimmer at the time of the writing of Mark of the persecutions. There are no systematic empire-wide persecutions, but there are small persecutions going on in different places, persecutions of early Christians. And what did you have to do according to the Roman practice? They would bring in a Christian and say, you have to denounce you have to denounce your belief in Jesus. You have to worship, if you were a Latin speaker, Jupiter. If you were a Greek speaker, you had to worship Zeus. And if you were found to have been a practicing Christian, the only way you could avoid death after doing all of that would be to give the names of other people they could arrest. So that's what he's talking about here. Persecution because you are a Christian. And remember, this is just the beginning of the persecutions, and Jesus puts all of these events that I've read so far up to verse up to verse 13 is all of the very beginning of the birth pangs. So this is where Mark's gospel sits, right here at the very beginning of the labor pains that produce the next stage. Are there any questions about any of that? Okay. Now we get a very curious thing. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it is necessary that he not stand, so this abomination of desolation is a person. And this, when you see the abomination of desolation, this is a quote from the book of Daniel. Daniel predicted that the temple would be defiled. And sure enough, it was. It was defiled about, and my dates are pretty bad, but within 300 and 400 years before the time of Jesus, the ruling king of Judea, it was a province of the Seleucid Empire. The king of the Seleucid Empire came to Jerusalem because he heard that the temple was so fabulous and he wanted to see it. So he just walked in and they said, well, you can only go up to here and you've got to stop. And he said, no, I'm the king. And he walked into the court of men, which was a sacrilege. Then he walked into the court of priests, which is a double sacrilege. And then he wanted to go into the Holy of Holies. I'm not sure if he ever got in there, but then he said, I want a statue of Zeus set up here. So the abomination of desolation was the king whose name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And I can tell you a minute ago, I couldn't remember it, but it just popped out. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he desecrated the entire temple. So it already happened once. Jesus is predicting that the temple will be desecrated again, just like Daniel predicted it. Okay? And at the time of the writing of Mark's gospel, the Romans were either about to conquer Jerusalem or had just conquered Jerusalem during the Jewish War between 68 and 70. And he's probably thinking that Titus, the son of the emperor, who was the general in charge, would walk into the temple. We don't have news that he did, but he did bring back to Rome all of the silver and gold from the temple. So I guess he did go in there at some point, or at least his soldiers did. But I left out one little thing because it's a stage direction. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it is necessary that he not, let the reader understand. This is a note to whoever's reading or performing, as I pointed out at the beginning of this course, it's probably a performance piece. This is important. Hit this one hard, okay? It's the kind of thing that Shakespeare wrote in the margins of his plays. Then let the ones in Judea flee to the mountains. But the one on the rooftop let the one on the rooftop not go down, nor enter to take up something from his house. So when you see this happen, get out of Jerusalem. Now, we have records that say this, but they can't be authenticated. When the Roman armies attacked Jerusalem, the earliest Christians were all complete pacifists. They left everything but the clothes on their back and walked out to the Roman army and surrendered. And when you did that, the Romans would let you pass through the lines. So the Christians escaped from Jerusalem and from other places too. They were pacifists, they didn't fight. And this was held against the Christians by Jews after the Jewish War. They refused to fight in defense of Jerusalem. So he says, look, when you see that about to happen, if you're in the field, go run to the mountains. If you're on top of a house, leave without picking. In other words, go empty-handed. And the one in the field, let him not turn back behind to take up his garment. Just leave. And this is exactly what the Christians did at that point when Jerusalem was about to fall. But woe to the ones being pregnant and the ones nursing in those days. So it's going to be a terrible time, because what the Romans did do, and we have historical records that are verified about this, when they went into Jerusalem, they wiped out the male population, which included all the priests, the Levites, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the elders. And they sold the women and children into slavery. Pray that it not happen in winter. Well, it happened over a 2-year period. So for those days will be a squeeze, which we translate as tribulation, but I love squeeze because it's very uncomfortable. Such as has not such a thing happened from the beginning of creation, which God created, until now, and certainly will not happen again, understood. So this is going to be the worst of it, but it's still not the end. And if the Lord did not shorten the days, all flesh would not be saved. We would say no human being would survive. But because of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. So there's going to be a squeeze that starts with the downfall of Jerusalem, and God is going to shorten the remaining days, because it will end up being so terrible that nobody will end up being saved. In other words, put under enough pressure, any of us would buckle. Okay? So all of this is happening before the end. And then if someone says to you, look, here is the Christ, look there, don't believe it. Because false Christs and false prophets will arise, and they will give signs and wonders for the purpose of misleading, if possible, the elect. Now, this is a very important statement, because what Jesus has done up to this point in the gospel easily falls into the categories of signs and wonders. In other words, during his earthly ministry, when he cast out demons, when he miraculously multiplied food, when he calmed the sea, Those are signs and wonders. But after Jesus leaves, those are no longer the signs of Jesus. So if somebody comes along walking on the sea or controlling the weather, that is not a sign of Jesus. That's a sign of a false Christ or a false prophet. But you watch out, I have warned you of all these things in advance. So we still don't know when the end is, but we know all sorts of horrible things are going to happen before the end. But if you can take one thing home with you, if somebody comes around walking on the sea, miraculously multiplying food, curing the sick, it's not Jesus. That part of Jesus's career is over. That belongs only to the earthly Jesus. Any questions or comments? Okay. But in those days, now we're getting to the end, the completion. But in those days, after the squeeze, the tribulation, after that squeeze, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its flame, and the stars will be falling from the heavens. And the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Notice, this is the only valid sign of the coming of Jesus, the coming of the completion. The sun's going to be darkened, the moon's not going to shine, the stars will fall down, and the powers in the heaven will be shaken. This is all a quote from Daniel about, well, not that, but everything in italics is a quote from Daniel about the end. Okay? So that's why Jesus says, don't pay attention if somebody does signs and wonders. That's not the sign. The sign is going to be cosmic. Why? Because God is shutting down this creation. God is turning off this creation. This age is starting to end. This is the beginning of the completion, the true end. Just like God created all that stuff, God is one by one going to turn it all off. It's all going to be destroyed. And this is something that my students always had problems with. So let me say it, even though I don't think you would have problems with this. Creation has a beginning and an end. This age, this ion, this age has a beginning and an end. God only intended to create the world for so long. The cosmos has a beginning, a definite beginning, and the cosmos has a definite end. And my students always say, well, that's not fair. Well, remember whose creation this is. It's God's. God sets the rules. It has a beginning. It has an end. If it doesn't end, we can't move into the next age where those who have done God's will live forever in peace and harmony. So we should be happy that this ion, this age, has a terminus, a completion point. Are there any questions about that? I think making it more palatable is the fact that everything is so abysmal towards the end. You know, we're ready for an end. And then they will see So it's not even you people here, it's the people who are still left at that time. Then they will see the Son of Man coming with or by means of clouds with much power and glory. All of the italics over here are quotes from Daniel. And then he will send the angels. This is important because he is the commander. The Son of Man is the commander of the angels. So he's above them. And Jesus is the Son of Man. Then he will send the angels, and he will gather. So he's going to send the angels, but he in particular, not they, he, notice how they skim over that in the translation. He will send out the angels and gather the elect, and he will gather his elect. So the Father's elect, God's elect, has now become the Son of Man's elect. From the four winds, from the edge of the earth to the edge of heaven. Now remember, the firmament sits like a dome over the land, and then there's chaos outside. So if you go from the edge of the earth to the edge of heaven, which is the firmament, he's going to gather the elect from all of those. Now, before we go on, I want to point out an incredibly wonderful thing that has happened. Here, Jesus says, the one remaining or enduring to the telos, this one will be saved. So the one who goes through all of this and remains faithful will be saved. That seems to say that what we do with our lives determines whether or not we are saved. Now, just hold on to that for a second. Then we find out the elect whom God chose will be saved. So notice what Mark does. God, and by implication, Jesus and faith, can save. And only God and Jesus as persons can save. And he said that also in chapter 10, then who can be saved? Well, for human beings, it's impossible but not for God. So God can save. Only God and Jesus can save. But at the same time, the person who perseveres to the end will be saved. So Mark does a wonderful thing here. Salvation belongs to God and Jesus. We can't do it for ourselves. But what we do matters absolutely. You see how he balances those two? You've got to persevere to be saved. You've got to destroy your life in order to save it. What we do in life, what we do is radically important, although God is the one and Jesus are the ones who can save. So he stresses how important it is that we do, that we act. What we do is radically important, but in the end, it's God who chooses who will be saved. So he values human freedom, and he also recognizes the absolute authority of God. And this is an incredibly Catholic way of looking at things. You know, what we do matters. We are not a religion that says if I have the right faith, I will be saved. No, it's the person who acts on faith, like the woman, your faith has saved you, but she had to go out into a group of men and touch Jesus. She had to act on what she believed. Jesus tells, was it Bartimaeus? Go your way, your faith has saved you. He had to scream out above objections and keep calling Jesus. So what we do is absolutely important. And it's God who saves. So human freedom and human action are absolutely necessary. And we still recognize that it is God who saves us. I just think that that's so beautiful, because when the man says to Jesus, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? Well, you know the commandments, do them. So our actions matter. It's not just what we believe, it's what we do with that belief that matters. I'm sorry, I keep pushing this point, but
So
But
the
I-
elect are not predestined.
no, there's no predestination here. It's what we do that matters. If you destroy your life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel, you will save it. Notice, the English verb is like the Greek verb. I can say the doctor saved me, agent, or I can say the operation saved me, that's the instrument. We can be and are the instruments of our own salvation, but God is the agent. So the Greek word works just like the English word does. You can have the subject be the agent, the doer of the action, or the instrument by which it happens. The way I put this in my book on God was, Jesus calls us to be the instruments of our own salvation by God. God's the one who saves, but what we do matters. Okay? Okay, so I'm all confused now. Okay. Okay, here we are. But from the fig tree, learn this parable. So this is a comparison. When already its branch is tender, becomes tender, and it puts out leaves, you come to know, you recognize that summer is near. Likewise, also, when you see these things coming to be, which things? The heavens being torn and all of that stuff. Know that, recognize that it is near at the gates. So it's right there. This is when you're going to know things. Amen, amen, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. Now, by generation, the Greek word generation, like our word generation, has two meanings. It can either mean 20 years, a generation of human beings, but it can also refer to a period of time, like the generation of the great empires in the first millennium or something like that. So it doesn't mean 20 years, it means a coherent period of time. This generation is what's happening since the sky was torn until the end. This generation will not pass away till all of these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words certainly will not pass away. But we still don't know when the end is, do we? Well, I mean, we know what's going to happen, but we don't know when. We can't put it on our calendar. But concerning the day, that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father, or only the Father. So even Jesus, the Son of Man, doesn't know when that's going to happen. So whenever somebody tells you that the world's going to end on a certain day, don't believe it. I mean, at least once a decade, a group of Christians go someplace because they think the world's going to end because they've had a prophecy. If Jesus doesn't know, we're not going to know. So basically, when are all these things going to happen? We don't know. Watch out. Be watchful. Because you don't know when the time is, the season is. You just don't know. It's like a human being on a journey, leaving his household and giving to his slaves authority, to each one his task. And to the gatekeeper, he commands that he stay awake. Stay awake, therefore, because you do not know, oh, I gotta rush. You do not know we're in the last pericope, but I can't go over an hour and a half. I'm sorry. So we'll start this one. We'll start at 13:33 next time. I was hoping to get to the end, but any questions before we go? May you have a wondrously prayerful Lent. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Prof.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Good
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.
Okay.
Come on, Anthony. I'm going to sign off.
Yes, thank you, Prof. I came a bit late.